Okay, friends. We will officially start the class on white magic. We last week we began rule number 1. Anyone tell us what rule number 1 is? Does anyone have it memorized? The solar angel collects himself, scatters not his force, but in meditation deep communicates with his reflection. And we talked about what that meant. We analyzed it word by word last time, and now we're going through the tips the Tibetan gives us about making the best of this course and understanding this principle. And we'll go through these one by one. He says, the first realization of the disciple is an understanding of the 3 worlds, the extent of his imprisonment, and the steps to take. Like Arjuna, his enemies are of his own household. So the first thing the seeker must know as he's proceeding and learning white magic, and remember, white magic isn't just a bunch of ceremonies where you're making stuff materialize out thin air and that type of thing. But white magic is the magical work of the soul manifesting through the personality. In other words, linking heaven and earth. You're linking heaven and earth with white magic, and once you link up with the soul, you know, anything can happen. You can have miracles can happen, or maybe you will just have the miracle of enlightenment or the miracle of seeing things you did not see before. But one of the things to see is the extent of your imprisonment and the steps to take. We are like in a prison here because we're away from our home. And that's what a prison is. When you're thrown in a prison, you're away from your home and you can't get home where you feel like you belong. You're in a place that is not nearly as good as home. And that's where we are here. But we came here for a reason to expand ourselves. We are limited on purpose. We agreed to this limitation. And in a limited form, we have to use our wits and our ability much more than we would have otherwise in order to solve the puzzles that confront us. And the first thing we must realize is the extent of our imprisonment, he says. The extent of our imprisonment. That's an interesting word. And this must be the prayer of the disciple. Once he realizes that, hey, you know, I'm in this world, I'm separate from my soul, or seem to be separate anyway, and I have to figure out how to get back. I have to get in touch with my home base. How do I do that? And you do that with this prayer is the key. Unveil to us the face of the true spiritual sun, hidden by a disk of golden light, that we may know the truth and do our whole duty as we journey to thy sacred feet.
What page would this be on?
What's that?
What page would this be on?
Oh, I don't have page numbers here.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, but I think it's, let me see if I can find it.
That was on page 59, JJ.
Was it? Oh, okay. Okay, so we must realize the extent of our imprisonment, which is deep. And the weird thing about our imprisonment is we don't realize, the average person doesn't realize he's imprisoned. He doesn't realize he's limited. He doesn't realize he has a true self with unlimited power that would be available if he could call home, so to speak. And so this is a very important thing to realize, is the extent of our separation and where we have come from and where we are. The next stage is the disciple finds the soul behind the disk of golden light from that prayer. It says, unveil to us the face of the true spiritual sun hidden by a disk of golden light. And behind this golden light, he finds a soul. And then he finds other seekers, his soul group and the master or inner teachers. He aligns the lower with the higher. He moves ahead and takes no shortcuts. This is one of the ways you can recognize a true teacher from a false teacher. A true teacher always has a bunch of shortcuts. He says, you'll hear things, or a false teacher always has a bunch of shortcuts. You'll hear things like, you can, if you follow me, you're going to, this will be your last life, and you're going to skip over all the 1,000 different lives, so you can just do it all in one life. Or you follow me, you're going to be undergo some rapture and go right straight back to God type of thing. They always are offering some shortcut if you just believe what they say. If you believe what the guru says, and you're instantly save a whole bunch of time. But DK tells us there aren't any shortcuts. You have to go step by step and learn. He says this about the seeker. He says, if he looks backward, he can only see the fogs and miasmas of the plains of illusion and fails to be interested. He looks forward and he sees the distant light which attracts him, but he cannot as yet see that which the light reveals. If he looks around, he sees but shifting forms and a cinematograph of the form side of life. If he looks within, he sees shadows cast by the light and becomes aware of much impediments, which must be discarded before the light which he sees in the distance can be approached, and then enter within him. Then he can know himself as the light itself and walk in that light and transmit it to others. Does anybody kind of identify like with some of the things DK says here? Like he says, he can only see fogs and miasmas on the plane of illusion. He looks forward. He sees a distant light which attracts him, but he cannot see that which the light reveals. A lot of disciples are in that situation. They sense a light, but not sure of all the things which the light reveals. Anybody identify with that? Or hopefully you're at the point where you realize you are the light. When you realize you are the light, then you look at you look within more than without. And when you don't realize you are light itself, then we tend to look outward for some outward authority. This is something he wants to emphasize, is he likes to throw the disciple upon his own resources, rather than, he doesn't want to be the only authority that we have. And one thing he says is the way he teaches, if you notice when you read his books, he doesn't say, this is how things work, A, B, and C, and D. Have you ever noticed that when you read his works, he just isn't like a regular teacher where he just says, this is how things work? Have you guys noticed that? So, but what he does, he will take a thing and then he will, his idea will have a central core. And then what he does is he teaches around the core, around and around, like in a spiral that spirals down until finally the core is hit. And then by the time he gets to the core part, if you follow along, you will understand it a lot better than if he just said, this is it, this is how something works, this is what the soul is, or whatever. So, and he points out that this is then an important aspect of the true esoteric teacher, is he will cover around the central core of the idea, and then give more details and more details. And as he's given these details, he's hoping that the student will have a flash of inspiration where he will see the whole principle. And then when this happens, the student will see the whole thing.
It's like leaving hints here and there where they're sure to have the most impact and point in the right direction.
Right. One thing I find funny about the Tibetan, he will often say something and say, this is a major hint. And I'll look and say, well, don't really see anything major here. And then he'll say something and he doesn't say this is a hint. And I'll think, boy, this looks like a major hint. And so I wonder if he does that on purpose somewhat, that I think sometimes he plants his biggest hints and doesn't even tell us it's a hint. But
like you illustrated in the book, The Immortal, all of
yeah,
the keys were given bit by bit.
right. Then he says the rhythmic nature of the soul's meditation must not be overlooked in the life of the aspirant. These psychic impulses in the life of the disciple are of a greater frequency and speed and forcefulness than in the average person. So he points out here that everything happens in cycles, and for everybody. We have cycles of advancement from the average person on up to the aspirant, on up to the master. There's cycles of opportunity. And he says they speed up for the person that is establishing soul contact. So if your life seems more turbulent than the average person, well, that's probably a good thing. It means you're making progress. And if your life cycle seems like there's more turnover, more things happening, and this will happen, he says, to the disciple as he establishes soul contact. Now, and he makes a statement about the attitude we should have. He points out that in our approach to learning, we shouldn't see ourselves as special beings. And this is one of the problems that many students have as they get a little bit of knowledge. They begin to feel that they are special or in a special group or head and shoulders above someone else. And it's difficult for the disciple, because the disciple, if he's honest with himself, may realize, I know a bunch of things that my neighbor doesn't know. Or I maybe can do some things that other people can't do, and that type of thing. And this creates a temptation to feel special. And this mustn't be negated by the disciple, even if he has a lot of ability, because he must he must see the equality in all souls. We're equal in ability. The only thing that makes us different is our decisions in life and where they take us. And so we must keep that humility about us. And he points out that it's really important to realize that the basics should be accomplished by the person that takes this course in white magic. If you go to a regular religious meeting, they will put a lot of attention on character development, to avoid pride and be humble and all these things, which are good. But he says the basics of character are assumed to be incorporated in you when you're advanced enough to take this course. What they look for is other things. They look for a person that is developed himself and is willing to forge ahead on the path no matter what happens. And these are qualities they look for, because developing yourself so you're basically a good person, that's like a first step. Now, in the churches of the world, becoming a good person is everything. I mean, that's all they teach you about. You must learn to be a good person so Jesus will love you, type thing. But he points out that this is a first step to be a decent, good person who's developed his character. That's step really number one. After you become a decent person, like most of you here are right now, I'd probably say all of you here right now are decent people, then there's other steps to be taken. And we don't forget to don't forget to polish off your character problems and that, but that's not the focus of a disciple. The focus of a disciple is to get some productive work done and increase his soul contact. It says teachers on the inner planes have much to contend with owing to the slowness of the mental processes of students in physical bodies. That's kind of funny, and when you think about it. But in the he points out that the teachers on the inner planes it takes a lot of patience on their part in dealing with us. It's about like some guy who's fleet of foot and can run really fast, and his partner is running in honey. Okay, and he's got to really kind of wait for the guy to move along, because he can just barely trudge along. And so that's the way we are in this physical condition. Those on the inner planes have so much more access to knowledge and spiritual forces than we do, that when we finally are able to rise above the miasma of this physical world and reach out for help, it's difficult for them to give us help, because we are kind of just poking along here. And so he says I have to have a lot of patience in working with disciples mired down in the physical reality. He gives some rules to the students to help. He says, to help in our progress, number one, the student must have absolute purity of motive. Okay, well, what does this mean? How can you not have a pure motive? Well, let's say if you just want power so you can be a powerful person and impress all your friends, and that's would be part of an impure motive. The person with a pure motive wants to have more power so he can be of greater service to his fellow men and women. The second part, he must still his mind and filter out distracting thoughts coming from all directions, and learn to use cycles productively. Yeah, we have all kinds of distracting thoughts, and that kind of create problems for us. Okay, then the third thing he says, we must attain calmness of mind. A perfect steadiness of the inner poise is what the masters need in those whom they seek to use. And fourth, learn to control thought. Thought is picked up by others. He says, scatter not your force. he talks about the soul on its plane. He says the soul is doing stuff on its plane that we can't even imagine. And to help us, the soul has to discontinue some things it's doing so it can place attention on us so that we can have better soul contact. But he figures it's worth it because the payoff eventually is great, because we must remember that we and the soul are one. So you might kind of imagine what all the soul is doing on its plane. It learns things on its own level. There's all kinds of great spiritual libraries and worlds to visit, all kinds of things. We can only imagine all the opportunities that's available when the limitations of the physical no longer apply. And it probably has a lot of fun and entertainment doing things it wants to do. And then it learns, well, Rick down there, he's wanting some attention and help and moving ahead and being one and making contact. So the soul has to discontinue some of the things it's doing there in order to pay attention. So it scatters not as force, but in meditation deep will communicate with his reflection. So to make it worthwhile for the soul, we have to be serious about making sure that we are willing to do this, take the steps necessary to establish firm soul contact. And then he talks about the importance of decision making for the disciple. Decisions are difficult because as a person progresses along, his decisions, first of all, are kind of made in the dark a lot. And so he gives us some advice as to how to make decisions. He said the average person chooses between right and wrong, just the average, and that's his criteria. So that's the criteria of the average person. He just thinks, well, this is right and this is wrong. But he says there's several ways to choose, and it becomes, as a person progresses, it becomes more complicated at first and then eventually more simple. The best, if you don't know for sure, he says, use your mind to the best of your ability, and eventually, make a decision to the best that you can come up with. He says, after you make a decision, then go with it. It's a little bit like the parable of decision in my book. The guy seemed to have made a bad decision, but he went ahead with it anyway, and he turned hell into heaven. But he says, as we advance, the way that we can make a decision will eventually change. And what happens if you encounter a situation where you're not sure what decision to make? He says, you wait for the doors to close. And eventually, when the doors close, all doors will close but one, and that one will tell you what decision you're supposed to make. And he says this won't work for everybody. It works for the person that's solidly on the path can apply this tactic. But if the person isn't solidly on the path, he won't be able to tell what that last door is. But if he's on the path, then he will be able to see the doors close and know for sure the next step he needs to take. That'll be nice, won't it? Because I'm sure everybody has reached points where they didn't know if they were making the right decision or not. But the disciple, the dedicated disciple, has the advantage. He can wait for the doors to close, and there is one decision left. Okay, any comments or questions so far? And he says this interesting point. He says, as the seeker switches from the focus from the outer to the inner, dissatisfaction, disgust, distaste, and a deep fatigue are characteristic very frequently of those who are on the verge of discipleship. For what is a disciple? He is one who seeks to learn a new rhythm, to enter a new field of experience, and to follow the steps of advanced humanity who have trodden the path ahead of him, leading from darkness to light, from the unreal to the real. He has tasted the joys of life in the world of illusion and has learned their powerlessness to satisfy and to hold him. He is now in a state of transition between the new and the old states of being. He is vibrating between the condition of the soul awareness and form awareness. He is seeing double. Okay, so the disciple, he's to successfully take this course, he reaches a point where he's dissatisfied with what the personality world will give him. Even if he could be a famous movie star or a politician, that wouldn't be enough to satisfy him. Even if he could be rich and have all the riches of the world, that would not be enough to satisfy him. The true disciple who's ready to become the white magician wants something more, and that more comes from the soul. And so this is the first stage of soul contact, is to realize that the solar angel is collecting himself. He's scattering not his force. He or she is sacrificing himself and paying attention to you so that you can make some contact and open up the kingdom of God. Join heaven and earth together so that you can take the first real steps toward entering the kingdom of God and the fifth sphere. Okay, any questions before we proceed? That's the basic lesson for the day. Don't all speak at once.
Oh, there you go. So
If you have any questions on that, we'll elaborate a little bit or whatever.
I didn't have a question. I just thought there was an interesting point he made in the chapter that he was coming at these rules for white magic not from the standpoint of actually practicing white magic, but from the standpoint of training white magicians.
Right. He says that's important. He says the training, he says, don't so much look for outward effects from the magical work, but concentrate more on the inward effects. The inward effects of the magic is the most important things, though there will be outer effects, but the inward effects are important, and this is where the training begins, is in the inward part of ourselves. Okay.
Yeah, I found it was really interesting that it correlates to things that I experience in virtual worlds. I'm a teacher of chivalry and virtue, and helping people to create better futures, and so I'm like the master Keiki Knight, and so I can relate to the way he's talking about, with his students and all that, and the things you look for, and it's like, the only thing is I'm working with mice.
Mice?
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
I mean, they're about knee high, and they have
Oh yeah.
mouse ears and tails and all that. But he's my head knight is a mouse.
Oh, okay. Cool.
It's been done.
Okay. Well, I'll end with this quote from DK, which is good. He says, "Intention and effort are considered by us of prime importance, and are the two main requisites for all disciples, initiates, and masters, plus the power of persistence." And he puts a lot of emphasis on the tortoise and the hare, and he points out that the tortoise always wins in the end because he's slow, he's persistent, and he doesn't deviate. He just keeps moving ahead. While in the story, the hare plays around. He's a lot faster and everything, but he figures there's plenty of time to reach the goal. And so he stresses this a lot in his teachings, that the person that reaches the goal is a person that doesn't give up. He just does a little bit every day. And if you do a little bit every day, it's amazing what you can get done. And the tendency of the beginning disciple is just to plunge in body, soul, and spirit and just do it all in a couple weeks. And then after a few weeks, nothing much seems to have been accomplished, even though he had all kinds of enthusiasm, and then he gives up. Whereas the person that just incorporates a little bit of the teaching into life every day and moves ahead inch by inch, he's the one that's going to reach the goal and establish solid soul contact. The soul is really impressed when he sees you forge ahead, no matter what distractions happen. Because we have all kinds of distractions. I've had all kinds of distractions the past couple of weeks myself. Anybody here not have any distractions this past couple of weeks? Rick, you look pretty peaceful. You look like you haven't had any distraction.
I had a dream come true. What can I say? It was a good week for me.
So anyway, we all have distractions. So this is an important thing that he stresses, is that no matter what distractions come, we need to learn to focus and first of all, be in a point of peace no matter what distractions are outward for us. And be in a point where we're settled on the inner part of our soul so that we can be at peace no matter what's going on. If you have an argument with your spouse, if somebody has an accident, if stock market went down or whatever, no matter what happens, if you make sure that you're centered on the inner core of your being where there's peace, so that you can move ahead undistracted. Because this is what he says the soul looks for. If the soul is going to interrupt its life on its plane and pay attention to you, you have to live your life in such a way that you're not going to let the outward world take too much of your attention away. You know, you have to make a living and take care of your kids and things like this, but don't let the outward world take away your focus from the inner. So no matter what's going on outwardly, keep your focus there. And this is perhaps the strongest point he makes in connection with this first rule, is not only is the soul shouldn't scatter its force, but we have to learn to not scatter our forces, our spiritual forces. Okay, let's move on. We'll say the song of eternal life here. Okay, assignment for next week is to move to lesson 2, rule 2. It starts on page 73. and goes to page what here? 90. And rule 2, I'll just read it to give you an inkling. When the shadow hath responded in meditation deep, the work proceedeth. The lower light is thrown upward. The greater light illuminates the 3, and the work of the 4 proceedeth. Anybody know what that means yet?
I'll take a stab at it if nobody else does.
Okay, hold that thought, and we'll if you know what it means, you're ahead of the average. And Jason or Joshua, we'll hold that thought for next week, and we'll call on you next week to give a rundown of that. Okay, any other comments or questions before we end? How many think they can come to the gathering this year? We've got a handful signed up for sure. You going to be able to make it, Joshua?
I'm not entirely sure. I haven't received an absolute spiritual verification that I'm supposed to go, but
Yeah.
I'm leaning towards it.
Okay. Well, we hope to see as many as possible there. And we, any other comments or questions? Appreciate everybody showing up, and hopefully you are enjoying this course and getting something out of it. So over and out, we will see everybody next week. And next week it'll be 2 o'clock Sunday afternoon.
Thanks, JJ.
Yeah, thanks a lot.